Today I am joined by Dr. Julian Agyeman. He's a professor of urban and environmental policy planning and is a Fletcher Professor of Rhetoric and Debate and endowed chair at Tufts University in the USA. Originally from Britain, he is the originator of the concept of Just Sustainabilities, which explores the intersecting goals of social justice and environmental sustainability. And his main research interests include environmental justice, sustainability, food sovereignty, racism, colonialism, urban development, and inequality. So, Doctor, thank you very much for coming on, giving me your time. Quite eager to hear about Just Sustainabilities. But before we begin, can you start about introducing yourself a little bit about your background? You don't sound like an American, so that'd be quite an interesting one.
No, I'm not an American. I've been living in the Boston metro area. I actually live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on Wampanoag and Massachusetts land, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am a visitor on this territory. But I grew up in East Yorkshire, just outside Hull, and was always fascinated by nature. I used to go bird watching at Spurn Point in the Humber Estuary. I used to go, looking at plants and landscapes in the Yorkshire Wolds and the Yorkshire Moors and the Yorkshire Dales. And I just developed a love of nature and the environment. And what's really interesting, actually, just as a slight aside today, there's been a lot of research done finding that more and more kids are getting into environment now, not as I did through the joy of nature, but because they're fearful of what the environment is and might become, climate change, species loss, etc. So I find that rather sad that a motivator for getting into the environment might not be the joy that I had, but might be the sadness of the potential loss of several of our most cherished environmental features. So I went on to university. I did geography and botany at university. So basically, I'm an ecologist, biogeographer, but I switched in my master's degree to social science. I did a master's in conservation policy because I was thinking, what is this stuff called policy? I know the science of conservation. What about policy? And I really then switched from science to social science. I became, self-defined social scientist, and I'm more interested now in how people get involved in what's going on around them and how they can become agents of change, either as individuals or collectively, preferably. And then I did my PhD in urban studies and, looked more deeply at questions of human relationships with nature and with environment more generally. And then 25 years ago, I came to the United States to become an academic and have been at Tufts University, which is based in the Boston metro area. I've been there ever since. And, my platform, as you mentioned earlier on, is this concept of just sustainabilities, which I think we're going to be unpacking in the next few questions.
Yeah, so let's just get into that. And so what is just sustainabilities? We've just had COP28. There's a big drive in the commerce world where I am in private sector, but it's just being sustainable. What is just sustainabilities?
Right. Well, we could spend the rest of the interview just talking about that. So let me briefly explain. When my students say, "Oh, Julian, isn't sustainability just one of these kind of, these fashionable ideas?" I say, well, you know what? The first time I read details about sustainable development was in the 1980, 44 years ago, the 1980 World Conservation Strategy. In 1987, we had the Brundtland Report. But in 1992, the biggie came, which was the Earth Summit, the Rio Earth Summit of the United Nations, which was the world's biggest ever environment conference. And, and yes, it was good that sustainability hit the world stage, but what kind of sustainability? After Rio, all of the examples I could find of sustainability in action were all about the environment. And I thought, this is good, but I can envisage a green world. We could regulate for a green world, but it could still be deeply socially unjust. Let me give you one good example from the United States, Minneapolis. Minneapolis is probably the second greenest city in the United States. in terms of parks, in terms of bike commuting, in terms of recycling. On every level, Minneapolis is the second most green city after Portland, Oregon. But is it the second most socially just? No, it's one of the most socially unjust. So you have this paradox, what I call the Minneapolis paradox, of a green city that has some of the worst black-white income ratios, has the worst wealth indicator, as in home ownership for African Americans. It's the lowest in the nation. So on a raft of social indicators, Minneapolis is lagging, but it's green. Point number one for all of your listeners, green does not equal social justice. Too many greenies over the years have been saying, oh, let's just green the city, let's just make it more healthy, and then everything will be fine. No, no, no. No, there are deep structural, racial, segregationist themes from sustainability or from urban planning in the early days of the United States. These won't go away just by greening the city. So Just Sustainabilities is about, how do we give people a better quality of life, standard of well-being, choice and opportunity? How do we do that in a just and equitable manner? And how do we do that while living within the limits of ecosystems? So these three or four conditions are, I think, vital to thinking about sustainable futures. Just to nail this green doesn't mean social justice idea home, I want to complicate things a little bit. So there's a big move in the United States at the moment to remove freeways. Freeways in cities tended to follow a very set pattern.
Just a quick one for the UK listeners. What's a freeway?
What's a freeway? It's a motorway.
Okay.
Great point. It's the M1. It's, yeah. So, but in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of federal funding to build freeways, okay, motorways, over cities. Now some cities like Boston are putting them underground. We had the big dig. The point I want to make here is these freeways didn't just go arbitrarily through cities. They went through guess which neighborhoods. They bust up low-income, brown, black neighborhoods. So the current administration, the Biden administration, is looking at freeway removal as a sign of, I think, reparative thinking. We need to repair the damage done. Let's remove the freeway. Problem is, what do you replace the freeway with? So often I see parks, gardens, and that's great, better than a freeway. But you know what happens once you remove the freeway and you put a park and garden in there?
Traffic clogs up.
Traffic clogs up. But no, but the more important thing is gentrification. House prices start to go up. So in some ways, bizarrely, it might be better to leave the freeway where it is, because that keeps house prices affordable to people on low incomes, minority people, immigrants. Now, it's a horrible thing to say, but if we just put green space unthinkingly in there, it will change the nature of the neighborhood over 5, 10, 20 years. Now, there are ways that we can stop that gentrification happening. And one way is robust, affordable housing policies before the freeway is removed. We need to stabilize housing before you remove the freeway. In that way, you have a chance of slowing or even halting gentrification. So, look, I'm putting a North American slant on just sustainabilities here, but the real reason behind the notion of just sustainabilities is I wanted a concept that sustainability policy people in local governments, sustainability activists could start to understand that social justice needed to be front and center in their concerns, not some kind of second or third order achievement. Because, in many ways, a lot of people sit around a table and they think, oh, let's think about the environmental, economic, scientific issues here. And then somebody says, oh, what about equity? Oh, that's a good idea. This will be more equitable once we've finished this project. But equity was not factored into the project from the start. So My argument is that if we are moving towards just sustainabilities, we are factoring in issues of equity and social justice as being as important as the environmental, economic, and the scientific/technological aspects.
And that's a really, really good concept. Even in the UK, if I think about it, um, take any city, maybe not London, but normally elsewhere, the richer you are, the more green space you have access to.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
absolutely the same around the world. It's pretty much constant around the world. I
But
mean,
they get the benefits of the greenery and the nature. Yeah,
exactly, and less of the disbenefits because they're further away from the big roads.
yeah.
Um, you had a case in Britain in 2013, the young girl that died of an asthma attack, and
Oh yeah,
yet in
because the housing, it was moldy and the landlord was not fixing the mold, and
yeah, but it was also
that's
right
an issue
on
for poor
the
people.
but it was on the she died of asthma, but it was pollution related
Yeah.
from was it the I can't remember which A road it was, but it
Oh, sorry,
was it
this is a different case. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
this is
thinking.
the South Circular or whatever. Anyway, in 2020, British courts made a radical decision and said that, air pollution was at least in part a cause of her death. So in Britain, you get the same things. Look, in the United States, urban planning, the way we planned our cities, was not, you know, segregation wasn't a byproduct, it was the focus. In the United States, until 1917, it was possible to order your cities. We call it zoning here. We have residential, commercial zones, industrial zones. It was possible to legally zone your city along racial lines. So in Baltimore, for instance, they had neighborhoods where there were black and brown people and white people, and you can guess proximity to open spaces was very different, whether you lived in a black or a white neighborhood. It wasn't until 1917 in the US that the Supreme Court struck down this idea of racial segregation through zoning. And so local authorities were scrambling and they said, look, what can we do that isn't racial, but it achieves the same effect? So they came up with what's called single family zoning, large lot zoning. You imagine houses with big gardens, big single family houses. Who can afford them? So over the United States, Minneapolis, for instance, 70% of the land was zoned for single family. It's an indicator of socioeconomic divide, but in the US, the socioeconomic divide very closely mirrors the racial divide. And so, so segregation was built in. And then we had this phenomenon called redlining in the 40s, in the 50s and 60s, sorry, 40s and 50s, where the government and estate agents, realtors here in the United States, um, got maps of cities and looked at the demographics, and they put red lines around what were called hazardous or grade D neighborhoods. Lo and behold, these are largely black neighborhoods. These redlined neighborhoods could not have any more government funding for mortgages, private sector funding. That's when the downward spiral happened in these redlined neighborhoods, and they are in all US cities. And guess what? Today, they are the food deserts. They are the areas where the city heats up hottest because there's less open spaces and green spaces and trees, and more tarmac covering parking lots and large, broad streets that you don't get in the more shishi neighborhoods. So you look at it over the last 100 years in the United States, urban planning has been based around segregation. I've found no evidence of the same in Britain. Yes, there are neighborhoods where different groups of people live, but that was not due to urban planning, segregationist urban planning in Britain. That's more due to socioeconomic factors. And also, I've got to say, the private sector in the UK. I mean, we know and we hear stories all the time about the realtor, the estate agent who shows the Asian or the African Caribbean family a different neighborhood to the one that they might have chosen themselves. So in the UK, I would say that racist urban planning, segregationist urban planning, white supremacist urban planning didn't happen in the same way that it happened in the United States.
Yeah, in the UK, it's much more class-based. It's not by the color of your skin. Yeah, it's your social class.
Yes, it is. But I mean, skin color does
Yeah,
have a
to
huge
some
effect.
extent. Yeah.
But here in the United States, all the data shows that, there are working class plus reasons why, people of color have it so much worse than, say, poor whites, on average.
Want to take this concept of just sustainability a bit more global now. So we also have a situation where not just in cities, but globally, richer countries like the UK, maybe the US as well, definitely those in Europe, they use they use developing countries as like a dumping ground for their waste, which is a very unjust thing to do because you're not dealing with your mess. How do you think we can deal with issues like this and take more responsibility in our home countries to deal with our waste?
Well, it's a great question, Hamza. And, again, let me just address it from a US perspective first, and then I'll move more globally. The environmental justice movement in the United States has been very, very, very successful. Um, and it really took off when two words came together in the early 1980s, environmental and racism. Dr. Benjamin Chavis coined the term environmental racism. And then a lot of people started to think, well, yeah, why is that toxic waste dump in my neighborhood, not in their neighborhood? Why, why is my bus service, or why is there no commuter rail service in my neighborhood, and why is the bus service so bad? Um, a whole load of factors came together, and people started realizing that environmental justice was a real concept. And a movement, a very powerful movement developed, which tapped into the renewable energy of the civil rights movement, which of course you don't have in Britain. And that's been I think, a very big factor in stalling, you know, British black activism in many ways. Because here in the United States, if you can show that your issue is a civil rights issue, you are golden. You are supercharged by the renewable energy of the civil rights movement. Um, but so the point I'm going to make here is the success of the environmental justice movement meant that a lot of companies stopped dumping in these low income and minority neighborhoods. And they thought, oh, where are we going to start dumping? Let's start dumping abroad. And, we know that there is a dumping site in Accra in Ghana, which is where my father's from. And the Agbaloshe dump is the home to literally the world's computer waste. Um, and you can see old computers with Kent County Council or, University of Alabama on them. A lot of waste goes to that place. Why? Because it's allowed to happen. Now, what can we do about it? There's been all kinds of um, proposals put forward, but I think one of the ones that sticks with me the longest, and it's been around the longest, is this idea of producer responsibility, that you need to be judged by the laws of your own country, not by the laws of the country where you intend to dump. I think that's got to happen. And I'm not an expert on the corporate side of sustainability, but I'd be interested to know where that kind of discussion is at the moment. I think also, I had a very interesting conversation in a bar with a barman the other day, and he was talking about China's out of control carbon production. And I said, but, you know, is it China's carbon or is it the world's carbon? China is the producer for the world. Part of that carbon surely is, I'm responsible. You are, Hamza. We're all responsible because we're buying Chinese products. We are driving the carbon footprint of China ever upwards. And so there's this idea now of, what about the governance of global carbon emissions? We can't just leave it to countries individually. It's not fair to just say, China, this is your problem, because it's not just your problem. It's our problem in two ways. One is we are fueling that carbon footprint, and two, we are reaping the disbenefits of an increasingly, carbon warmed world. So we need more global governance. more global responsibility for carbon production. Again, Just Sustainabilities, I think, provides us with a framework to think about that idea. But, you know, I think this idea of responsibility is not discussed enough. We basically, you in the UK, here in the US, we are offshoring our carbon problem. And, you know, it's all our dirty linen is getting washed in the laundrette that is China in terms of global carbon production. So I do see a complete rethink of global responsibilities as being part of a move towards just sustainabilities. Unfortunately, I don't see those conversations happening too much. But, you know, the loss and damage discussions that seem to dominate the last COP meeting are a sign that these discussions cannot be avoided. And I just want to also add another facet to this, because these loss and damage discussions are essentially discussions about reparations. We cannot escape this word in the United States. There are cities around the country, the state of California, various places are looking at what would reparations look like? And I think on a global scale, we have to look at what reparations would look like. We shouldn't leave it to families like the family of Laura Trevelyan, the BBC reporter, whose family have decided to fess up and say, look, the Trevelyan family made its wealth in the Caribbean. That's good, but we want governments to not just apologize, but to look at restorative justice, actions of reparation that will aid these countries that are essentially strapped by debt. They are now losing their brain power to places like here, Cambridge, Massachusetts, where people come to MIT and Harvard and all the startups from all around the world, bright PhDs, Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria. People are coming here, not staying in their own countries. You know, I heard a statistic that there are more Ghanaian doctors in the US state of Maryland than there are in Ghana.
Wow.
Why? Because they can earn shed loads of money. And so, you know, Ghana was the first country to gain independence from Britain in 1957. My father came over in 57 to study law at Hull University. It's where he met my mum. And, you know, when I look at it, at first we took timber, gold, cocoa from places like Ghana. We took ecological resources. Now we're taking intellectual resources.
Yeah, but that's how you stay strong, stay powerful. Because, you know, if you've got a declining population, as to be
Oh,
an
yes,
economic
of
power in the
course.
world, yeah, this is how
Oh,
to keep your
totally.
domination. Yeah.
You cream off the brightest in the world. Some would argue that, you know, some education systems in the world are not that good because they know that people from around the world want to come here and we're going to get the brightest and best. I think that applies in the United States in many ways. So look, the point here is that just sustainabilities is, you know, it's not just a sort of local concept. It does apply globally, but globally, we're going to have to do a lot of thinking and talking. And I see us at the very beginning stages of that.
Yeah, because you mentioned reparations there. And even if we think about climate change, the vast majority of its effects disproportionately affect the people in the global south anyway. People in Africa, as you mentioned, or
Yeah,
Pakistan or India and so
sure.
on, the poorest. So there's an justice issues there because it's us in the rich countries producing the emissions. And in particular, the wealthier you are, the more emissions you produce anyway. But it's the poorer you are, the more likely you'll feel the effects of climate change. And that's a massive
Totally.
issue.
I mean, that's, you know, I mean, I used to say it, you know, before everybody suddenly, you know, got onto this concept of climate justice. I used to say the poor are the first and worst hit, and they are least responsible for the production of carbon. Yeah, look, it's a massive ethical and moral dilemma. But what does the West want to do? It wants to keep it on the science, on the economics. This is a massive moral question. And for those of your listeners, one of my books, I think, and I don't know whether you've looked at it, Hamza, but it's actually available open access online through MIT Press, and it's called Sacred Civics. And the book really looks at this question of morality and ethics, and it really opens, I think, with a very provocative statement. You know, the major problems that we have today are not economic and technical or scientific. They're deeper than that. They are questions of morality and values. And, you know, when you look at indigenous knowledges, you know, building for the seventh generation. I mean, what a profound, I mean, that is sustainability from several hundred years ago, from indigenous thought, you know, several thousand years ago. But I've heard it, you know, mentioned through Native American circles. And there's so much in indigenous and, you know, and older thinking that I think we can use now. But we do need to get back to these values discussions, these discussions of responsibility that I mentioned in relation to carbon production. But, you know, the political times that we're in of, you know, retrenchment, of the rise of the right, the anti-democratic tendencies that are happening, these discussions are even less likely now than they were X number of years ago. So we are in a predicament. We do know the way out. It's just that we're not embarking on that journey together.
Mhm. Yeah, and even the financial system would, I think, benefit from thinking about just sustainabilities, because one is based on the idea of limitless growth, which is inherently unsustainable. And then if you look at the mechanisms of finance, like interest-based debt, and so much how much debt is in the world, what we're doing is we're borrowing from the future to justify our often unnecessary wants right now, and just kicking the cost down to future generations, which is the opposite of what you just mentioned about the Native Americans and their seventh generation. Like they will never consume at this level or have a desire for consuming at this level, because they understand at some point someone's going to pay the cost.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, the one of the reasons for this is, I mean, when you think about some of these, you know, earlier societies that had this principle and still have this principle today, you know, they were connected. They were connected to the land, to spirits in the land. They were connected to all kinds of ceremonies and annual celebrations. You know, they didn't see themselves as separate from, but part of the land, the systems that maintained, you know, our life support. We've become arrogant, and we don't see the necessity for them anymore. We are, you know, we look aghast when we see rivers, you know, exploding and flowing into villages, and this is the consequence of an unhappy planet, a planet that is being pushed and probed in so many ways. And as you say, the downside, the downstream effects often land at the feet of the poor. And in many ways, you know, what is wealth but being able to buy yourself out of some of these issues? I mean, you can't buy yourself out of all of them, but, you know, I've heard there's a big boom at the moment in the super rich buying up land in New Zealand and installing deep nuclear bunkers. You know, the prepper websites are getting very popular these days. Even in Britain, I've heard that, you know, people are, you know, starting to think about stockpiling, and these are not actions that are, you know, going to protect us all. Yeah, I mean, you know where we can go with that
Yeah.
conversation, but we do. The thing is, you know, some people throw their arms up and say, "Oh, it's useless. I don't know what we can do." We do know what we can do, but there are so many forces, and you've identified them. A primary one is the financial system and capitalism. There are many forces that are absolutely against any form of justice and sustainability.
Yeah, I want to, I know I sent you a list of questions, but this might be a bit of a tangent now. So I'm just thinking about the origins of why we're thinking in like this very secular kind of thinking about the world and how we operate in it. Do you think some of this unjust sustainability or unjustness goes back to the Renaissance and how we think about the world? For instance, if we think of everything as if God doesn't exist and it's just a materialistic world, the only value you can assign anything is the utility you get from it. So a river or a stream, you're only going to measure it by the utility that you can get. So you're not going to think about future generations that much. You're not going to think, okay, there's nothing inherently valuable, it's just my utility. But often religions and cultures, they'll have these kind of supernatural or non-materialistic values you assign to things as well. So once you ignore that, and there's a wisdom in a lot of that, that allows you, that opens a doorway for all this just ravishness and just disparaging nature.
Yeah, look, another one of my books, 2015, called Sharing Cities, was a fascinating book. I co-authored it with a good friend of mine. And we got into evolutionary psychology. We're both geographers, Duncan, my colleague, and I. But we had to stray into all kinds of things because we were looking at the origins of the concept of sharing. And so here's the very simple fact. Our ancestors would not have got off the plains, the savannas of East Africa, by competing. One man, one woman, one person cannot bring down a large beast. You had to group together. You had to learn skills of empathy and communication to bring down the beast, share out the meat fairly, and then, continue in this kind of this lifestyle. Nobody competed then. I would argue that sharing was one of the original motivating forces behind the growth of humanity and growth of settlements. What was, settled agriculture? It was all about the harvest and divvying up the harvest. You know, so I think we can make the case that sharing preceded, self aggrandizement through through getting goods. And so, to come up to today, all of the satisfiers are about, bling, more, this, I want, that's what it's about. I had a very profound experience this summer. I was actually in England on June 30th for my mother's 85th birthday, and on the flight back to Boston on the 7th of July, I had a terrible pain in my neck. Anyway, long story short, it was actually a very serious abscess, which was pressing out on, and it was making my hands shake, and it was making my, anyway, I had an operation. But for that week in hospital, I started to reevaluate my life. When you've had a profound shock to the old system, you start to think about, who am I? Am I doing what I really want to do? But by and large, I'm a pretty happy kind of guy. But what I realized in that week was that the pleasure I got was from going up to the hospital roof, sitting in the healing garden, and just being there with nature, hearing the sounds, feeling the warmth of the sun. And what I realized is that those are the real things that you need, are those really common everyday things. And when your life has been in the balance, that's what you need. You need to feel human again. And I wasn't dreaming of expensive things. I was just thinking, God, wouldn't it be nice to walk in the woods, to go and, walk barefoot along the sand? My point is, we need to regroup around more communal, cooperative ventures. I mean, it's no coincidence that cooperatives are growing massively. It's no coincidence that the world's biggest cooperative in Spain was very, very marginally affected by the 2008 crash. Cooperatives are more resilient. We need to move towards more cooperative ways of thinking. In Just Sustainabilities terms, I talk about the concept of co-production. Take a local park in Bristol. And two scenarios. One is the city says to local residents, we're going to develop a new park. Here's the designs. what do you think? The other way, the co-production way, is to say to the community, we want to co-produce this park with you. We want to co-design it. We want to co-manage it. And we want to co-program it. What events do you want in there? I think the co-production approach, the cooperative approach, the Just Sustainabilities approach is going to result in a more community-centered park, a park that will be self-policing because it will be used by the community. And what we've found, and I've got a park just through my kitchen window, I can see it right here. It's a park that is full of children, running, shrieking. There's a basketball court there. This is North America, so there's a ice hockey, so kids go around on roller skates and do their ice hockey. There's table tennis. It is so well used. There is no antisocial behaviour there. Co-production of public space, I think, is another. And I could go on and on and on of examples of how in different areas of sustainability or planning, we can do these more cooperative approaches that I think have a better chance of attracting public interest, but B, I think they will have greater longevity than if, the traditional paternalistic council approach, to building a park is taken.
Interestingly, you can expand the notion of cooperatives to even financial arrangements. For instance, I'm just thinking now, because I know in Islam, usually it's forbidden, like economically, we're not allowed to take interest. And kind of the idea behind it is because it links to this cooperativeness. As a business, let's say me and you have a business idea, and today we have to go to a bank and get some money or find something you can take a loan. The bank, all it cares about is the economic return. It doesn't care about that much about what the business is doing. But when you forbid interest, there's no interest rate is zero. It encourages a lot more equity investments or cooperatives, right? So everyone has a risk, as a skin in the game, and that forces a level of responsibility on everyone involved. So that's greater justice in that financial transaction.
Sure. And look, just sort of let's look at the focus of the financial world, the markets. I mean, one, you could make an argument that markets are actually a cooperative space. They're spaces where people come together to exchange, to buy, to sell. And so in many ways, I don't have a problem with markets. What I have a problem with is unregulated markets that do really nasty things to those people that you and I identified as being the recipients of environmental injustice. What if we gave markets social or human values? My pensions here in the US are all managed through a broker that follows very strict guidelines as to who we can invest with. We can invest well in things that do social good. Here's the good news. All of my students want to do that. They don't want to just dump their money in carbon producing industries. And so I think that there is, an opportunity through, regulated markets to do things that are progressive, that are different. And, and cities do this all the time. They raise bonds for various projects. So, and Chicago, I've heard, is investigating at the moment, the city actually intervening in the local food system to support food retailers in those food deserts that I mentioned earlier. The city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil was the first to do this in 1992. So 32 years ago, they had a mayor who he himself had grown up in food insecurity. And so they created this Directorate of Food Security, which brought in all of the council, and it's a 6 million person city. I mean, this is not a small city. So basically, the city regulates food markets. It sets the price for certain essential foodstuffs that retailers have to sell to poor people. The rich, the retailers can sell at whatever they want. The city also has what are called people's restaurants, where for $1 you can get a good meal, and students go there. You know, the poor, even business people go there because it's quite a. These restaurants are quite vibrant places, and the reason why this works in Belo Horizonte is because of precisely what I said earlier. When they were thinking about the food system in the city, they thought we need to center social justice. We cannot have this as a purely economic thing. And this is not just, a socialist city council. This is a socialist city council working with the private sector. That's remarkable. So social justice is central. Brazil has a constitutional right to food, but they have this clause called food with dignity. We, you in Britain, we in the United States, we push people towards indignity over food. How undignified to have people begging for food. We force them to those indignities. The very famous food writer here in the United States called Frances Moore Lappé, Diet for a Small Planet. In 2009, she wrote, Belo Horizonte is the Brazilian city that has abolished hunger. What happened? School productivity went up as kids were getting good meals before school. And remember, school meal plans or school breakfasts? It was the Black Panthers in Oakland, California in 1968 that invented this idea of giving kids good meals before school because you can't concentrate if you're hungry. So the city of Belo Horizonte did this again by centering equity and social justice. And so, if there's, the first point I made in this talk was green does not mean social justice. The second point I really want to make is we have numerous examples around the world of where cities have centered social justice, good results have happened. And the first mayor in 1992 was a socialist mayor. Belo Horizonte has had right, left mayors. Nobody has tried to dismantle the system that was set up by the socialists in 1992. I think a really important point here is if you can do good progressive policy making, it generally is publicly supported. I mean, look, I know ULEZ in the UK has been a kind of political set of hoops, but the congestion charging, which initially Ken Livingstone did, and then Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Boris didn't dismantle it because he saw that it was good and people wanted it.
And plus, the money from the congestion charge actually goes to funding positive
Exactly.
things.
It goes exactly. And that's, I criticize my American colleagues here because what they've done is they've missold road charging. Here in the United States, excuse me, people think, oh, it's a road tax. That means the politicians are just going to get rich. Livingstone was very, very clever in saying every penny of that money that is raised in tax will go to sustainable transportation. I don't know what it's now, 300 million, 200 million a year. You could do a lot with that, especially if you leverage it with other funds. And so yeah, I mean, good progressive policy making is very difficult to unpick, whether it's a food system in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, or whether it's road charging in Stockholm, Milan, London. Yeah.
Okay, and let's say as grassroots in our communities, right, we want to do a project and we want to make sure it's just and it's sustainable. What kind of questions should we ask ourselves?
Um, Not just who's at the table, but who's setting the table. Um,
So
we
I'm just
need
trying
to,
to think about your example you mentioned about the restaurant and the food one. Let's say I want to set up something for my local community, whatever it is. What kind of questions should I be thinking about to myself about how I'm going to make this just and sustainable?
well, let me give you an example from Boston. In 1982, an organization called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative established themselves. But they didn't set up the organization until they'd done a demographic survey of the neighborhood. And they constituted the board of directors to look like the neighborhood. Number one, you cannot have an all-white board of directors or with only a few minority faces on if you are in a minority neighborhood. It just doesn't work. So your board of directors has to look and think like the neighborhood. That's number one. Number two, you must ensure that all voices are heard. We know, you know from your community, Hamza, that even in diverse communities, there are voices that get heard more than others. Often they are male. We need to make sure that all voices are heard. We need to, work with other stakeholders in local communities. They may be local businesses, obviously the local authority. I mean, all of these are established good practice community development sort of tactics. We need to, work with other networks. We need to, make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel. Make sure we do our homework and make sure that, our project is something that is going to serve the community and that they can see some form of ownership, not necessarily fiscal, but, when I think of those cafes that you go to that have been around a long time, or those restaurants, that we feel a part of us, even though they're not fiscally part of us. So, and I'm mindful of the time here, but I just want to outline one other major concept, I think, of just sustainabilities, which relates directly to what you're saying. We're all very good in the sustainability, environmental, urban planning movements. We're all very good at saying what our place should become. It should become more resilient, more sustainable, more green. But the other side of that is the concept of belonging. It's all very good saying, what our city can become, but who gets to belong in our cities? We are moving homeless people along. Here in the US, we're flying immigrants from Florida to Massachusetts. We're sending them from Texas to New York by bus. We are moving people against their will. We are making benches with armrests that people think, oh, that's nice. It's a bench with an armrest. No, it's to stop homeless people sleeping on it. We are excluding a lot of people. So between becoming and belonging is a big gap. I don't want those of us who are elites in cities to decide what cities are going to become, because a city can only become as good as who gets to belong in that city. Mm-hmm. And if we move out the poor, the gay, the black, the homeless, we're just going to have an elite dreaming about what cities can become. So this concept of belonging, this idea that your board of directors should look like and think like local communities, is an act of inculcating belonging in many ways. And I think, we've got plenty of ideas on what cities should become. We now need to focus more on who gets to belong in cities. And this is a very big issue in the United States. I know it is in the UK as well.
Indeed, that's a very good point. I think that's been a wonderful conversation. I'm feeling we can talk a lot more about these issues.
Next time, Hamza, next time.
Tangle in many different things. Yeah. I'm going to say thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed our discussion. I've learned a lot. It gives me a lot to think about as well.